Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Renaissance. It is a period of time in European history where there is a rediscovery of classical learning, a re-embracing of logical, rationalist, what we call humanist learning. That is, learning that can happen outside of Christian teaching, outside of the church, and that sometimes challenges the notions that religious people have about the world. This is not something new. Socrates dealt with this, much to his chagrin, of course, much to his demise. And the same is true when we get into the 15th and 16th centuries. Now, the Renaissance is sometimes used as a example of how different European society had become by the 15th and 16th centuries and compare it to earlier periods, the medieval period, often referred to as the Dark Ages. But we're going to try to look at the Renaissance as a kind of cultural phenomena that also includes changes in technology, changes in ideology, changes in theology as well. Before we go on, let's talk about some terms. The Renaissance literally means rebirth. It's a French term, and it was coined to describe this period's change. And it is often used a like counter pejoratively, or maybe chauvinistically to differentiate from medieval scholars. And often during the Enlightenment and in later periods, up until about the 20th century, there was this belief that during the medieval period, basically from the fall of Rome, fall of Western Rome in the 5th century, all the way to the 15th century, we had 1,000 years of darkness and depravity and depression and repression and ignorance. That's not completely true, but compared to the Renaissance, the period does seem to take a lot longer to address some of the social and scientific and economic problems that Europe was facing. Let's move on to philosophy. Now, philosophy in the medieval period and even before then was a hodgepodge of ideas that included sciences, theology, mythology, speculation, logical thought processes that sometimes were not terribly logical, or they were based upon faulty premises. Now, during the Renaissance, there is a detachment between what we can call the hard sciences and the softer sciences like social studies or history or philosophy or theology and things like that, versus the hard sciences, things that you can use math to verify. So physics and chemistry and the motion of the stars, so astronomy. These can be more easily predicted and more concretely verified by using mathematical models. There are very few mathematical models that can help you understand history or philosophy. Um, the Medici are a prominent family that you may have heard of. You have definitely seen their family symbol, which is three spheres or three balls, sometimes connected by like kind of cherry stems. It is often used in pawn shops to denote trustworthiness, and that goes all the way back to the Medici family, an extremely vastly wealthy family that is what we call the middling sort, what we could arguably describe as an emerging middle class. They are not born nobles, so they are not the upper class, but they are also far too rich and far too powerful to be the working class or the servant class. So they complicate that picture a little bit. So they're somewhere between the upper class and the serving class. So they are the middling class. And they're not the only family, they're just the most prominent family. And we're going to use them as an example because of our crunch for time here. They, like other middling sort families to a greater or lesser degree, dominate not just the Florentine, but also world politics, or at least European politics. They also dominate the economy, they dominate the rule of law, as well as sponsor artistic and scientific endeavors. And finally, we come to the Reformation. The Reformation is actually a movement within the Catholic Church that is attempting to root out corruption. However, uh, the corruption is extremely deep. It is entrenched. It is justified by not just scripture, but also by church dogma and practice and tradition. And uh, this will come as no surprise to you, but the people in power like to stay in power, and that is true of the church. And any attempt to reform, any attempt to rationalize the church is often met with hostility, with name calling, with people excommunicating each other. This is true when it happened with Pope John Paul II. It's true with Pope Francis, so it does happen in the modern period that any changes to the church's dogma, the changes to the church's practices are often met with staunch opposition and sometimes rather irrational uh, um, um, arguments that are based very tenuously upon loose interpretations of scripture. So why Renaissance? Why do we say a rebirth of human learning? It's a very loaded term to differentiate it, as I mentioned before, from the medieval period, which is often cast as the Dark Ages. It does refocus human learning and understanding upon more evidence-based and observation-based, what we call the empirical model. And there's also an alteration of artistic styles, the rise of new forms of governments, or actually the rediscovery of older forms of governments like republics, for example, and also a flourishing of scientific investigation. And this happens in a very brief, brilliant period of time. And that's essentially why the Renaissance is a thing. We will have a video from Crash Course, where John Green argues that the Renaissance wasn't a thing because people didn't run out and go, hey, we're living in the Renaissance. But the same is true for the classical period. Nobody ran out and said, hey, we're living in the classical period or the medieval period or whatever. So his logic I have a problem with, especially given the changes that do happen. So I would argue that a Renaissance does happen, but I think that it is fair to say that it is the acceleration of some changes that happened during the medieval period. One of the things that changes is urban life. As we mentioned in the medieval period, there was an expansion of urban life, nice urbanization. So cities are becoming bigger. You're having people flock to them because that's where trade is. That's where some of the new innovations like universities are beginning to emerge. It's also the places that were extremely devastated by the Black Plague or the Black Death. And so there was a vacuum, a job vacuum in these cities. And so it drew a lot of immigrants. And these immigrants brought new skills and new opportunities, but they also brought with them new demands. When you have an accelerated urbanization like you do in the Renaissance period, Cities very quickly outgrow their old walls. They outgrow their old infrastructure systems, particularly in getting water. Some of these cities approach bringing water into their domain in a very innovative kind of way and very scientific kind of way. Um, a lot of people think, well, water just kind of appears out of nowhere, but it all has to come from somewhere, and it has to come from clean sources. That's one of the things that does emerge during the Renaissance is the understanding that clean water is one of the safeguards to preventing disease within a city. They didn't quite understand microbial contamination, but they knew that if you drank water that was contaminated with, say, feces or dead bodies or trash or whatever, you were far more likely to become ill and spread that illness than if you had drank clean water, fresh water. And this is true in London, in Paris, in um, Krakow and Warsaw and other places throughout Europe, and especially true in Italy. Now, some cities' size are increased as wealth becomes more and more concentrated. And part of this is because you have a very wealthy class that is invested in trade. And that trade means you need things like warehouses, you need places to house workers, you need larger mansions to show off your wealth. And so you get this kind of middling sort that begins to emerge in the late medieval period. Now, a family like the Medicis made a lot of money transporting people to the Holy Land during the Crusades. So they got a nice little kickstart. If you could get in on the ground floor of of the transportation business during the Crusades, you typically did very well. Another family that you might be familiar with that did very well is the Borgias. The Borgias also were a middling sort who made a lot of money being transports of people to the Holy Land and then people coming from the Holy Land or maybe goods as well. So these middling sorts, like the Medicis, begin to take control of politics. They begin to determine the direction that their city-state and the territories that they control go, what kind of policies are set. They are not traditional aristocracy, but they are as wealthy or sometimes more wealthy than the landed elites who have had power for hundreds of years. They're also not peasants, they're not day laborers, they're not artisans who create rugs or lamps, they're not artists who create paintings or sculptures. They're bankers, they're merchants, they're traders in money. And so they are somewhere between the elite and the lower classes or the serving classes. Thus, we have this kind of middling sort or middle class that begins to emerge. Now, these Italian city-states, first off, the Italian peninsula, after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, was subject to many, many invasions. And eventually it breaks down into small regional concerns and sometimes city-states. And one of the city-states, many of the city-states actually, that emerge are based on trade and particularly trade from Asian goods, as well as transportation. And so a lot of these tend to be coastal cities, places like Genoa, Pisa, Venice, Florence, Milan. They are made extremely wealthy, these small little city-states, and they have outsized armies to prove it. So, for instance, a Genoese army was um, hired by the French, by the entire country of France, to help them fight in the Hundred Years' War. And they were more than happy to do it because they had that many soldiers, so they became mercenaries. By the late 14th to early 15th century, these city-states are in kind of competitive monopolies in trading with Ottoman Empire and Arab lands. They have certain agreements with certain powers in certain cities. So, for instance, the Genoese are trading in Constantinople, and they're trading directly because they had assisted the Turks in overthrowing the Byzantine government. It was just in their better interests, better economic interests. So you have this combination of wealth concentrated in very small hands, very few hands, but unlike modern uh, wealthy people, the medieval uh, desire of the middle class to show their power, to display their power, led to the sponsoring of some incredible works of art. Now, this is a very unusual period in human history. Typically, historically, outside of the Renaissance, rich people investing in job creation is extremely rare. Most affluent people use money to make more money. It makes no sense to take a risk in opening a new venture. It makes no sense to take a risk in starting a new business or sponsoring new research when the status quo pays way, way more. This is a factor that plays into why the Italian city-states do not sponsor Christopher Columbus and his voyage westward. They, the Italian city-states, are past the period of innovation and renaissance. They no longer have to prove that they have the power and the wealth and the political pull to make things happen. They're more invested in keeping things as they are. And that is a classical wealthy attitude. Stability is great for the wealthy. The risk takers, like Spain, for instance, relatively wealthy, not terribly wealthy, not nearly as wealthy as the Italian city-states. They are the ones who eventually wind up sponsoring Christopher Columbus's suicide gamble to head westward. It is a massive investment that makes no economic sense to the moneyed elite in Italy. So here's what Renaissance Italy kind of looks like, and we're going to look specifically at the Republic of Florence, which is in the above the knee of the boot of Italy. It's kind of a orangey colored thing. Let me see if we can get the highlight there. There we are, the Republic of Florence right there. Some of the Renaissance advancements are in art and architecture. These often go well together. This idea of ideal proportions is drawn from architecture, from classical architecture, um, from an architect named Vitruvius, and Leonardo da Vinci pays homage to Vitruvius by creating the Vitruvian Man, which shows the ideal proportions of human beings. There's also advances in science as well, and literature and poetry. Uh, these changes are part of the exertion of that wealthy, that very bright period in European history where the wealthy began to sponsor um, artists and scientists for the greater glory of their name. So let's take a look at, and I believe I've covered this before. Let's take a look at medieval art and it being very, very flat. We have a guy in the background here. We don't know if he's further in the background or maybe it's a child or whatever. We also have these folks here who are stacked like cordwood. Not very good perspective. It looks kind of forced. And then finally, what direction is this book facing? And this is actually one of the late medieval masterpieces that was created in the early 15th century. And it is supposedly depicting a church scene, but you have no perspective. It's just kind of a flat backdrop. You don't know what direction anything is facing, and it has no perspective. This is very untrained or poorly trained art with poor concepts of spatial relations, how the world looks, and how the human body moves. Now let's compare this to the School of Athens by Raphael. Now, first off, in the previous painting, and like much medieval art, most art was intended according to Christian dogma at the time, art was a gift from God intended to glorify God because God is a narcissist, evidently. The only reason God wants you to be able to paint well is he wants you to be able to paint great pictures of him, showing him how great he is. That's the way it's supposed to work. This changes in the Renaissance period when you have artists like Raphael and Donatello and Da Vinci, all depicting Roman or pre-Christian or Greek works, particularly Roman and Greek. The School of Athens, of course, supposed to be Socrates in the middle, but actually Raphael used this opportunity to draw a portrait of Leonardo da Vinci. In fact, most of the artists of the Renaissance, the big names, Botticelli, Michelangelo, are all in this picture somewhere. If you get a chance, do look up the School of Athens by Raphael and see all the little hidden nods to other Renaissance artists that Raphael kind of puts in there. But another thing is really important is look at the perspective. You can almost feel like you could walk down that hall and eventually reach the outside. It would be a world that you could recognize. Also, you see how people are in very natural poses. You could imagine people standing like this or moving like this. There's also this sense of movement, right? And you have people in the foreground doing things other than worshiping God. They're learning mathematics or they're teaching architecture. You also have the depiction of non-Christian gods. You have Athena and Artemis that are pictured in the alcoves there as well. So how does art imitate, or how does art influence science? It seems like the two are divorced, but the truth is they're not. With anatomy and physiology in particular, a human understanding of anatomy and physiology comes about in the Renaissance period when the Catholic Church does give permission to a man named Antonio Paololo, who is the first true Renaissance artist given official permission to study and dissect human bodies to see how they work. So the church wasn't necessarily against any of these advances at first. Later on, it becomes a little bit more complex as some other problems crop up in the Catholic Church, particularly some corruption problems and some succession problems for the Pope, but that's further on down the line. So he begins to understand how the human body works. In some earlier medieval period, skeleton drawings didn't look very much at all like human skeletons whatsoever. They look kind of weird, and their bone connections didn't seem to make much sense whatsoever. Muscles didn't seem to make much sense whatsoever. The way people moved didn't seem to make much sense. So that changes with the investigation of anatomy and physiology. Paololo is followed by Da Vinci. Da Vinci and others begin to dissect and they begin to publish books, works of art, and anatomy and physiology journals that very accurately reconstruct the human body, everything down to nervous systems and circulatory systems, major organs, and of course the way that humans move. And this idea of ideal symmetry of human bodies eventually works its way back into architecture and into the understanding of the physics behind building construction. So this all happened because of people like the Medicis, and we're going to spotlight them as one of the middling sorts who are patrons of the arts. The Medici family needs everybody to know just how rich and influential they are. They are, for lack of a better term and for lack of a better example, the Kardashians of their day. They are conspicuous consumers. They patronize great works to get the word out that the Medicis are a powerful family. They patronize artists. They patronize engineers and architects, all to basically brand themselves. You can think of them as the Kardashians mixed with the Trump family. Like Donald Trump puts his name on everything, quite literally, whether it's a gambling den, a high-rise tower, a university, bottled water, steaks from Omaha, you name it. He puts his name on everything. And the same thing is happening with the Medicis, except they're not saying the Medici Taj Mahal. Everybody knows who sponsored, say, St. Peter's Basilica or the works of Michelangelo and the works of Da Vinci. The Medicis never really become monarchs outright. They do marry into the princely families. They also do secure the title of dukes, and they become a grand duchy, which is very, very powerful. And they, of course, put four popes on the papal seat that are drawn directly from their family. So children, for example, would be chosen pretty much from birth to be the one who would eventually replace their cousin or their uncle on the throne or something like that. And they begin to maintain a lot of this power, even though their star fades by the end of the Renaissance. They are eclipsed by other more powerful families and the discovery of the Western Hemisphere by Europeans, and the exploitation of the Western Hemisphere by Europeans does eclipse Italian wealth. But they do hang on to power. They do hang on to that Grand Duchy well into the 18th century, so well into the about the time that the Americans are thinking about revolting from the British Empire. So that's a very long time. And that's reflected, their patronage is reflected in a lot of the artistic work. For example, the majority of Renaissance artists have at some point depicted one Medici or another. And they've depicted them rather lifelike. Some of them with very fancy garb, some with warrior garbs, some as members of the church, and some, of course, as typical merchants. And it's because of this patronage that you get a lot of advancements. And it's a funny thing when you sponsor one type of investigation, it often has a ripple effect. For example, the Medici sponsoring of humanities and sciences, particularly scientists or artists, eventually has a ripple effect in the architecture. It has a ripple effect in art with ideas of perspective and ideal proportion. It has a ripple effect into anatomy and physiology and understanding the way that human body works. And very, very importantly, it has a ripple effect in engineering, particularly military engineering. Castles with long, tall walls are no longer viable by the end of the Renaissance period, and instead you get these squat, kind of very stout fortifications that theoretically should be easy to climb, but actually are intended to stop or deflect cannon shot and make it easier to have enfilading fire or crossfire for approaching armies. It also changes the way we see the universe. The prior to the Renaissance, the church taught and many people believed that the Earth was the center of the universe. That at the center of the universe, because God created the earth first and then he created the lights in the heavens, the sun and the moon, that was the way that the world worked. And they worked in these perfectly understandable cycles. And this was backed up by Aristotle's view of this, of the planets being kind of suspended in these perfect crystalline spheres that they followed. And so it was like kind of like a clockwork kind of thing. And then later on, a classical mathematician, Greek mathematician named Ptolemy, he mathematically proved that these heavenly bodies could be predicted using mathematics. So this Aristotelian and Ptolemaic view seemed to support the idea that the Earth was the center. There was a problem, however. There were exceptions. There were times when it seemed like Mercury went backwards. If it was a perfectly predictable clock, why did you occasionally have unpredictable results? And of course, this was explained away by humans not quite understanding God's plan, and that God would intervene and make things move in a certain way. And so this church dogma just kind of reinforced the eccentricities and errors in mathematical understanding of the universe. This is complicated later on by a devout Catholic investigative scientist named Nicholas Copernicus. He was a Polish astronomer, a lawyer, a physician. He did a lot. He was what we would absolutely call a Renaissance man. He commented upon and improved earlier works by European and also Muslim astronomers. After the fall of Constantinople, a lot of this information which had been kind of kept from Europe begins to flood into Europe, particularly Muslim commentators upon classic works, whether it be medicine or science or astronomy or mathematics or whatever, begins to flood into Europe and helps kind of jumpstart European investigation. So he uses a more mathematically sound approach to prove that the Earth instead revolves around the sun. And he prints a book called On the Revolutions of the Planetary Spheres in 1543, which changes the way that we see the solar system, that the sun, which is immensely more massive than the Earth, rotates or is rotated around by the other planets. And that we have the order. Anybody who has done a grade level science project probably knows the solar system better than most. So this is what our new system looks like with the Copernican system. Now, his system is not quite perfect. It still has some problems, but it fits better, and it explains better why it sometimes seems like Mercury goes backwards for us. All right, let me go. So here we have our middling sort. We have a middling sort of wealthy merchants, wealthy bankers who are spending their money to get the word out about how great their city is. They're doing it for the glory of Florence, and by doing it for the glory of Florence, for the glory of their society, they're also increasing their own name. It's a very Republican point of view. And I mean Republican in the sense of a republic, not the American political party. The middling sorts are patrons of the arts and architecture, and they begin to amass political clout with that. And they challenge the older medieval power structures to a degree. They kind of challenge them, but then they become part of them. And once they've finished becoming part of them, they are invested in the status quo, and they kind of drop all this kind of making the boat rock kind of thing. And that's explained by the end of the medieval period. I'm sorry, by the end of the Renaissance period, that depictions of nude bodies, depictions of the classical period begin to disappear, and we gravitate more and more back towards religious iconography, because they're invested in keeping the Pope on the throne, and we don't want to rock too many boats and make too many waves. So they kind of lay off and they pull back on that. Scientific investigation into art, architecture, physics, and astronomy, and all of these different sciences and philosophies begin to alter the way humans understand the universe, sort of. Not completely. We're not quite at the Enlightenment, which happens a couple of hundred years from now, but it is a step forward, and that's the progress of human history. Is it seems like we have some steps forward, but then we take some steps backwards and maybe a couple of steps over to the side, and maybe sometimes we forget to step at all, and then eventually we do make a little bit more progress. But it is not a linear progression. Italy has spawned renaissances and kind of imitations throughout Europe, and the Italian patrons are probably the most famous, but they're not the only ones. The Renaissance spreads to places like England and France, Holy Roman Empire, into Poland. Doesn't quite penetrate Russia. That's kind of a far backwater, but it definitely penetrates the lowlands, what would later be known as Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands. It doesn't quite penetrate Spain as much, but it is influencing it. Eventually, however, during the Renaissance, that Catholic Church tolerance towards innovation and challenging the way that we thought kind of goes away, partly due to some internal problems. In 1378, there is a internal split or schism within the Catholic Church. The College of Cardinals elect an Italian pope that they named Clement VI. But then they return home, and the French cardinals, who made up the majority of the College of Cardinals, announced that they had been coerced and renege upon their sponsorship of Clement VI, and instead elect a second French pope, who sets up his papacy in Avignon, France, whereas Clement VI has returned to Rome, Italy, to sit upon the papal see there. And so we have Clement VI in Rome, and we have Clement VII, who is actually sitting in Avignon, France. So we have two people claiming to be the head of the Catholic Church. And this is a schism, or the split. European kingdoms begin to back one or the other, and they excommunicate each other, which of course opens up the floodgates of war. Because if you are excommunicated from church, you are basically an outlaw from Christianity, and anything that happens to you is not a sin. If I kill an infidel or I kill a heretic, I don't go to hell. I've actually done God a favor, done God a solid. We get to fist bump, maybe a high five. We do a special handshake, and I get into heaven, right? So the European kingdoms are split between these two anti-popes. For example, France, of course, backs the Avignon papacy. However, their enemies, the English, back the Roman papacy. Surprise, right? Well, this is another way for the French and English to kind of hate each other and to try to attack each other. Same thing is true with the Spanish kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. They're both backing the Avignon papacy because it's closer, and because the Holy Roman Empire, which is a rival of theirs, is backing the Roman Pope. Eventually, this all becomes problematic, and there are successors to Clement VI and Clement VII, and this continues to create problems within the Catholic Church, within the Catholic unity. You don't know who to follow. There is no one authority in the Church, and so the successors to these original cardinals eventually get together and elect a third pope in Pisa, Italy. He takes the throne in Pisa, Italy in 1409, and initially the idea was that the pope in Rome and the pope in Avignon would both abdicate, and we would have a pope living in Pisa, Italy, and he would unify the church. The problem was no sooner did the meeting break up, then we have a third pope who has excommunicated his two rivals, and those two rivals, of course, excommunicated him. And so we have three popes running around Europe claiming papal primacy until 1415. So it takes another 6 years before the church finally gets its act together, gets rid of all of the popes, elects one pope that they all solemnly swear and pinky swear with each other that they will back forever and ever. Amen. And this returns the church's reputation and the cohesiveness of the church, or at least they hope so. The problem is the split goes deeper than just a temporary tiff between Italy and France. The cardinals who chose the pope were split between a domestic loyalty and, of course, the access to power and fear of a local populace. So there's an emerging nationalism that begins to really dominate the politics of the Catholic Church and also begins to emerge in European political considerations. The French have become very much more nationalistic and much more nationally identified following the Hundred Years' War, and this just solidifies it. The schism does create uncertainty as well as opportunity within the Catholic Church, which opens it up for further corruption. Attempts to reform and regulate the church had been tried before, and they had met with little success. As I mentioned, as a recurring theme in human history, entrenched power loves the status quo. If you are part of the power structure, you don't want changes because it may mean a lessening of power, a lessening of prestige, a lessening of money for you. So you don't want to let it go. And the papal position was one of power, luxury, prestige, and nobility. Some families, such as the Medici, spent a lot of money and used a lot of influence and called in a lot of favors to make sure that their chosen candidate would get the position. So they're really invested. So there's a lot of corruption going on. So the Medicis are not always good guys. In fact, the Medicis are actually not good guys at all, even though they sponsor science and philosophy and art and things like that. Now something changes in the later period of the Renaissance in the 1450s. We get the emergence of the first truly commercially viable movable type printing press. Now, it's often credited to Johann Gutenberg, and he does spend a lot of his own money to ensure that this new technology would come into widespread use. And he did have church backing, absolutely, because his whole idea was to print these books as quickly as possible for the Catholic Church to be able to disseminate to the different universities that were sponsored by the Catholic Church to ensure that the Catholic Church could hold on to the cachet of being the prime educators for Europe. So the printing press had been around for a while, and in fact, a printing press with movable type had been invented in China before this. However, none of those had really taken off because of the cost of creating the different movable types. It's a very arduous and expensive project, and it was just cheaper to hand copy. That changes in the medieval period, or late medieval, early Renaissance period, as you get better metallurgists, better craftsmen, and much more meticulous, precise instruments. And so this new technology is emerging, and it allows for the dissemination of information on a scale unprecedented, absolutely unprecedented. Let me put it in perspective. Between the year 1200 and the year 1400, about 1 million books were printed by hand. They were copied by hand and disseminated. A year after the printing press became a commercial success, so about 1458 or so, after it becomes really commercially viable, there were 4 million books per year that were printed. So this is an immense explosion in the dissemination of information and ideas. But why is that important? Why is the dissemination of ideas and information important? I want you to think about, blogs, tweets, Facebook, cable news, Wikipedia, cell phones, all of that. What if all of those went dark? What if there was no more internet, no more radio, no more cable TV? How would you know what was happening in your community? Word of mouth, maybe? Rumor, maybe? What about what's happening in the world? What's going on in the world? How would you know about international incidences and presidential speeches or the newest innovations? How dependent are we upon information? How for granted do we take information? I would argue we take information as granted as we do water or electricity. These absolute amazing miracles that would blow the mind of anybody from the Renaissance period. You have water in your house on demand with really great pressure and it's clean water. What? You flush a toilet and it all goes away? That's amazing, right? These are incredible leaps in information that we take for granted every day. In fact, they become annoyances to us. Well, one of the ways that you might have gathered information would be to go to a central communal place, maybe a church, for example. If everything went dark and you didn't know where to get information, maybe you would head to a local church, like people did in the Renaissance. In fact, the church doors of churches were often like posting boards. And in 1517, Martin Luther, a Catholic monk who had struggled with some of the dogmas and some of the teachings of the Catholic Church, finally reached his breaking point and nailed his 95 theses, or 95 points, his bones of contention, if you will, upon a church door, and sparked a radical sea change for Christianity in Europe, one that wasn't necessarily peaceful, one that was extremely bloody. Amongst his arguments, he said that salvation comes from God, not from works. And this is in response to the idea that your sins can be forgiven if you have like kind of a balance sheet. Okay, you've done a bad thing, like you've slept with your neighbor's spouse. Well, you need to do this type of work to kind of balance the scales. You need to go out and give charity to the poor, or you need to donate to the church, or you need to say penance, or you need to go on pilgrimage or something like that. And then that will wipe clean this sin that you have. And that humans have no right in saying what can be forgiven and what can't, that only God can give salvation. He also argued that laymen could be their own priests, that you could interpret the Bible for yourself, that you can read God's words and have a personal connection with God. He also renounced the idea of celibacy in priests. This is a big problem that Martin Luther had. He constantly lusted for women. He felt that he was failing God until he had this epiphany that actually nowhere in the Bible does it say that the priests have to be celibate, that this is all part of a dogmatic pronunciation by the Catholic Church. This is just a practice that is not in the Bible. He also argues for the publication of the Bible in the vernacular instead of the Latin, and vernacular means the local language, so in German, in French, in English, and whatever. Average people would then be able to read and learn from the Bible, and that there was no need for the church to interpret the Bible, that God would help them understand. The emergence of Martin Luther's critiques and the later publication of his critiques printed on that printing press that I mentioned before, were disseminated throughout Europe. And this leads to a political schism within European countries and principalities. Remember how I said that those countries were backing different papacies because of their national interests? The French backed one and the English backed another, and was largely politically motivated. The same is true with this Reformation effort. Some countries adopt Reformation and break away from the Catholic Church for political reasons and use the Reformation and the Protestant Revolution as cover. Martin Luther was the only one who attempted to radically change the Catholic Church and almost succeeded. John Wycliffe was an English philosopher and theologian in the 14th century, and he advocated translation of the Bible into the vernacular just like Martin Luther did. He also argued that the church was fallible, that the church made mistakes, but the divine word, that is the biblical word as it is written in the Bible, is infallible. That's God. The other stuff is just things that people have added on, right? He also believed in this idea of predestination, that God has already determined whether you are going to heaven or not. But he was declared a heretic and killed in 1415. Jan Hus, a Czech priest and philosopher, also in the 14th century, decried the moral failings of the medieval and Renaissance church in the 1400s. He particularly had a bone of contention, this idea of selling of indulgences. Indulgences were basically get out of jail free cards, maybe more accurately, get out of hell free cards that you could purchase if you were wealthy enough. If you made a large enough donation to the Catholic Church, any sin could be forgiven. Any. And he also denounced crusades. He denounced this idea of sending people to foreign lands to kill other people, and that popes and bishops should be emissaries of peace, since Christ is the Prince of Peace, and therefore they should not call on people to take up the sword. He was also killed in 1415, burned at the stake for heresy. So why was Martin Luther so much more successful than John Hus or John Wycliffe? The printing press. Unlike Jan Hus and John Wycliffe, Martin Luther's message could get out on a scale unprecedented, and it could be smuggled into areas, and it could be printed and reprinted and reprinted cheaply and easily. There's also the political climate has changed. So the Renaissance, is it a Renaissance or just not medieval? I'm not convinced that the medieval period was such a bad period for intellectual understanding, science, and investigation. However, the Renaissance does put it to shame. Art, architecture, science, and investigation into all realms of human understanding kind of reinforce each other. New powers are rising and give the hint of a modern European possibility, as the French, who had long been kind of divided into regional loyalties, emerge as French nationalists, as the English, who had differentiated themselves from Welsh and Scottish and Irish, begin to see themselves as united. a united kingdom. Technology changes the battlefield and it changes the mind as well. So that's it for this week. Make sure you're reading chapter 15. I'm going to give you some resources to better understand some of the advancements of the Renaissance. And this chapter may also help you understand Dante's Inferno a little bit better, because although it was written in the 1300s, it was published in the 1400s, shortly after the emergence of the printing press. So, a lot to think about, and I hope you guys enjoy this week, and I'll see you again next week.